पर ये पैसे देकर नहीं देते। हाँ, absolutely.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, firstly, Sundaraman sir will be joining us soon. So, very warm welcome to all our guests, faculties, and students to the interim budget panel discussion. Today, we stand at the intersection of economic insight and foresight. We are honored to have distinguished speakers with us who will navigate us through the intricacies of interim budget 2024. I'll now hand over the stage to Professor Sharadnath Bhattacharya, who will introduce our esteemed panelists and moderators and share a few words about the session. Thank you, and let the enlightening session begin.
Thank you, Himangshi. A very warm welcome to this session, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by saying that this is almost a regular practice across B schools, and IIM Shillong is no exception to host a post-budget analysis session that what the budget has been about, what sectors has been at the receiving end of the budget, good or bad, and how the things are going to be for the next 1 year when these people join. Half of them will join the industry after their placement and half of them will join during the summers. So budget analysis is essentially a very important part in our program. So the Niveshak team organizes this, and Niveshak is this is a finance club, a group of students with finance background or those who have substantial interest in finance forms this club, conducts events to their interest, keep themselves updated with what's happening across the finance, banking, and allied domains. So that's a brief story about Niveshak. I'm sure subsequently people can discuss this. But let me welcome the guests for the day. To begin with, we had Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India in this panel. But he has just messaged us that due to certain emergency meeting, he is unable to join us and have sent his best wishes. So let me begin by welcoming Dr. Sundaram Ramamurthy, the MD and CEO of BSE, who is expected to join us very soon. He is a qualified cost accountant and a member of Indian Institute of Bankers. He has served as the MD, as the Chief Operating Officer of the Indian arm of the Bank of America. So he has almost around 4 decades long career involved in stakeholders management, setting high corporate standard practices, extensive work experience in NSE and public sector banks. Next, I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Madan Sabnavis, the Chief Economist of Bank of Baroda. He's also having 30 plus years of experience across development banking, commercial banking, engineering space, commodity exchanges, and credit rating agencies. Not only that, he has keen interest in academics as well, publishing, I think, more than 2,500 articles across various financial publications. And he is also author of 4 very interesting books: Macroeconomics Demystified, EcoQuicks, Economics of India, How to Fool All People for All Times, Hits and Misses Indian Banking Story. Very interesting books. He has been part of various research advisory committees from SEBI, from IIBFs, and has been a member of other educational committees as well. Welcome you, sir. Next, we have Ms. Radhika Rao, Senior Economist, Executive Director of DBS Bank, Singapore. And he has been a part of economics and macro strategy team of the group. She has completed her studies from St. Xavier's College, and he is highly known for her expertise in economic analysis, particularly focusing on the Asian region. I think something that has been in the news, the Asian region, the contribution of Indian government towards the Asian regions, our neighbors, and something that I think the panel will discuss, and we are waiting for that. Finally, as a moderator, we have our very own alum, PGP alum, Mr. Vivek Singh, who is a qualified chartered accountant and has still recently has served as the OSD to the Honorable Union Finance Minister. He is also the alumni representative in the Board of Governors, IIM Shillong. So with this, I welcome all the panel members and I hand over the baton to Vivek. Thank you. Vivek, I need to
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for this very liberal introduction of all the speakers. I'll just dive into the topic, and it's been almost 48 hours since the budget was presented in the Parliament, and we have all seen reactions to the budget, ranging from calling the budget innovative, futuristic, to some even going to the extent of calling it insipid and boring. So I'll straight away open it up to the panel. The budget has taken a very consistent approach, which we have seen over the last 3-4 years, of powering growth through capex. And this was reflected in the capex numbers, which have reached almost 11 lakh crores. And to put it into context, it was more than just above 3 lakh crores 10 years back. So what do you think are the key drivers of the growth of the Indian economy going forward? And how does this budget contribute to it? Mother sir, if you would like to begin.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vivek. Could you just repeat the last part, as if I was distracted by the phone which rang?
So, I mentioned, sir, that the budget has taken a very consistent capex or investment route to growth over the last 3 years. And what do you think are the key drivers of the growth going forward? And how do you see the present budget contributing to it, especially in the context of the budget positioning itself as a vision document for Viksit Bharat?
Okay. As you mentioned, I think the budget has been very, very consistent in terms of its aspirations. The aspirations of the government, I think, in the last 3-4 years. So there's a lot of continuity which we see in terms of how the budgets have been drafted. Now, I think what's important to understand is the budget is actually a statement of account of the government of India. When I say statement of account, just like how you have a balance sheet and profit and loss account, it's a similar kind of a structure which you have for the government of India. So it is nothing else but a huge Excel sheet which is there. And all the numbers out there pertain to some aspect of the economy. It's based on certain assumptions which is being made about the economy. And whatever aspirations, ideologies there, whatever are going to be the thrust factors of the government, those are the numbers, some of the numbers are going to reflect that. So let me try and explain what I mean by it. So the government actually assumes that the basic assumption is that there's going to be a certain kind of growth in the economy. So today when we say 10.5%, It is important, even though the last year, that is 23-24, is not yet completed, but we're talking of 24-25. The reason is that all taxes are juxtaposed against the growth in income. So just think of all of us here. If the economy grows at 10%, let's assume my income goes up by 10%, then the government knows that based on whatever are the final tax rates, they will be getting a certain amount of revenue. So I think the growth in GDP is something which we start off with. You also start off by saying what's going to be the overall size of the budget, because the government size cannot just keep increasing without any rhyme or reason. And then we decide on the fiscal deficit. So I think when we talk of the fiscal deficit, I would say that is actually the starting point of this budget, where we say that we are going along the path of fiscal prudence, which has been defined by something which we call the FRBM, which says that the fiscal deficit ratio should reach 4.5% by 25-26. So given the fact that we were 5.8%, you say, okay, now we're going to go to 5.1% for this year. And hopefully, I think next year the number will be 4.5% or maybe something lower or in and around that particular range. So once I've stuck with the fiscal deficit ratio, which actually very broadly, very loosely speaking, is the total amount of borrowings. So what I'm not able to generate from within the system, I have a certain amount of expenditure, the balance will have to be met from borrowings. That's what the fiscal deficit is. Now, the question is that how do you make the most of this total quantum of budget, the quantum of borrowing, which is possible? So what I actually do is I have my own priorities, which I lay down. So I think this particular government has made it very clear that capital expenditure is going to be its priority. And that's going to be the driving factor for growth as far as the government is concerned. So today, when we say that the capex is 11.1 lakh crores, the whole idea is that to the extent that it is possible from the 47.5 lakh crores, which is the overall size of the budget, that is around 25% of it, is actually going to be devoted towards capital expenditure, meaning thereby I'm going to spend it on roads, railways, main things. There's a lot of coming on defense. So when you ask this question about saying, how is growth going to come about? Yes, if I'm going to spend on roads, there's going to be demand for steel, for cement. Automatically, those industries will start booming. And we have seen that they have been doing well. All infrastructure-oriented industries have been doing well on account of the push which has been given by the government, given the fact that the private sector has not been investing at the same rate. So in this kind of a situation, growth is going to come essentially from the capital expenditure program of the government. Now, normally in a budget, you could also say that there could be certain kind of tax incentives which could be given. But I think this is an interim budget, and the FM has been saying all through, don't expect anything dramatic. And therefore, there's been no talk on the taxation front. So if at all there's going to be anything to spur growth coming on the taxation front in the form of investment or savings, that could be coming up in June, July when the main budget is introduced. So then what happens to the rest of the expenditure which we're talking of? A lot of it is committed in the form of interest. You have to pay interest, you have to pay subsidies, you have to pay pensions, you have to pay salaries. So what the next aspiration of the government is on the development front. When I say development, it is more on the social welfare front. So what the government has done is that you have certain pet programs of the government in terms of employment, in terms of food being given, housing, water. Now, these are the programs on which we have seen substantial allocations, but those allocations have been kept more or less on par with last year. So if we look at all the programs and say that if I'm giving 100 today, what was it last year? So what we have seen is that there's a budgeted number of last year, there's a revised number of last year, and the government has opted for the higher of the last two numbers. That is, if the revised number was higher than the budgeted number for 24, they have used the revised number as the platform for 25. In case the budget was higher and you're falling short for some reason, you've again done it wrong. India, where we have a lot of underprivileged people, you need to have affirmative action, you need to have direct intervention by the government to uplift society by making living more bearable. So that is where the rest of the money is being spent. So summarizing what I've said, I'm saying growth is going to come mainly from the capex part. Sustenance is going to come from the social welfare programs which the government has laid down. That's it. Thank you.
Radhika ji, any initial reactions to what Sir said or what I asked in general?
No, certainly. I think I do, mirror what Madan mentioned. I think the past few years, especially in the past 4-5 years, there has been a tendency. So, if you talk about pre-pandemic or in fact, pre 4 years, the biggest criticism that economist community in general used to come up with the budget is that, first of all, it doesn't cover everything, meaning a big part of the spending used to be kept outside the balance sheet. That was one of the problems. And the other one was that the targets in terms of deficit target, underlying growth, revenue growth assumption, all of that was too ambitious. Now we have moved one big cycle post-pandemic where most of those ills have been covered. When there was a big chunk of pandemic-related spending being done in fiscal 21, and I think that was a very commendable move because in one stroke, the markets in general were were able to digest a bigger deficit number. What does that mean? It basically means that the government was spending a lot more than they were earning. So they used that opportunity not only to bring in a lot of pandemic-related spending on the balance sheet, but also some of the off-balance sheet spending onto the balance sheet. So what does that do? Again, it improves the transparency of the budget math, right? So that is one big tick. And the other one that has happened is that in a way level shifted your deficit numbers. We should again remember that all this deficit interim budget discussion everything is about the central government, right? We are leaving a big chunk out of this discussion with what is happening on the states front. But just insofar as we're talking about the central government, they have level shifted from about 3% of GDP kind of optimal level. We are now talking about, we were at 9, we're now at about 6 and coming towards 5%. So level shifting has happened. And then thereafter, we are looking at consolidating finances. So I think that's another big take. And in fact, past 2-3 budgets, you will hear this word about numbers are conservative, right? Revenue assumptions are conservative. Growth is pretty much realistic. So these are some of the adjectives we are using for the budget, which is very different from what we used in the past. And the third aspect, as Madan mentioned, completely about the capex cycle. I think there is a general recognition that just being manufacturing focused or just having manufacturing ambitions unilaterally does not help. We'll need to put money behind where we want to increase our footprint, and I think that is where the emphasis on infrastructure is. And again, if you look at just capex, 11 trillion is what the number that the finance minister mentioned. There is also a wider gambit you can put in. There are under other subheads. You will find things like resources of public enterprises. You will find things like grants given or transfers for asset creation. If you bring together all those, the number towards capex in general becomes much larger. And I think that goes to the point that we need to spend money on roads and railways, roads and highways. We need to spend money on railways, on power, and so on and so forth. So that way, I think it's the right move to do, and I think it will continue to increase. But we still need to take in the context that of 100 rupees that we spend, 20-25 is going towards capex, right? A big part, 75-80%, is still sticky expenditure, relatively sticky expenditure. That's where the salaries are, that's where the subsidies are, that's where the pension, so on and so forth are. So over time, the anticipation is that the quality of spending mix will slowly become more capex heavy and less sticky. But again, it's not a shift you can make very soon because there is, given where we are in the growth cycle, in the development cycle, we can't really cut back and go all in capital intensive heavy. We have northern neighbors who have done that, and it comes back to bite at some point. So that shift has to happen gradually. But I think there is a very concerted effort towards improving that capex and current spending mix.
Thank you. Professor Sharad, are we waiting for Sundaramanji, or should we go ahead with the rest of the questions?
So he's facing some technical issues at his end.
Okay. Okay. So we'll continue. Madanji, just drawing from your initial comments, one follow-up question on the question of investment. You mentioned that the private sector investment has still not picked up in India, in spite of the fact that in the last 2 budget speeches, it was mentioned that the large public sector spending should largely be able to crowd in private sector investment. What do you think is the reason for that? Is it a correct reading that the private sector investment has not picked up?
Okay, so in India, it's a large country. It's a large canvas which we're looking at. So everything is happening, and lots of things are also not happening. So today, when we say that the government or the budget is able to crowd in private investments, it's essentially as I said, if you're going to spend on roads, when there is demand for cement and steel, if you look at the cement and steel companies, they are definitely investing more in capital. So therefore, we see an increase which is taking place in investment in all industries which are linked to infrastructure. So if you look also at chemicals, you look at machinery, there is some bit of investment taking place. Now, typically in India, we should remember, I think it holds everywhere in the world, that no company will go in for investment if it has surplus capacity. So what is surplus capacity? There is nothing firm which is on it, but the thumb rule is that if my capacity utilization rate is in the region of around 78 to 80%, that's when I will start investing more. If I see that demand is going to be buoyant, then there's reason for me to invest. Otherwise, if my capacity utilization rate is at a lower level, then I think there's little reason for me to start buying more machinery, setting up more plants when there's not enough demand which is there. So I think there's a kind of it's a kind of a divided kind of a picture which we're getting. If I look at all the consumer-oriented industries, I look at the FMCG companies, I look at the consumer durable industries, I think they have surplus capacity. So they're the ones who are actually not investing. I mean, I'm not to say they're not investing at all, but they're investing in limited quantities. So why do I say this? Because we follow the commentaries, the investor presentations made by all the companies every quarter. And what we have seen is that most companies in this particular domain are the ones who are saying that there are problems on rural demand. Even in urban demand, it's only the premium goods which are selling. And therefore, we are waiting for the demand to pick up. We expect demand to pick up in next quarter. That's when we will start bringing in our investment. So I think there's always this optimism, something will happen forward, because if you're a capitalist, you will have to be positive about the future environment. Economists can be a bit pessimistic or realistic, but if I'm in business, I'll have to assume that things are going to look better. No, there's a share price will tumble if I say I don't see anything future. So every CEO will say that things are going to improve. So the long and short of it is that what the government is doing, it's able to bring about the backward linkages to all the industries which are related to their spending. So there is a lot of investment taking place there. So if you look at some of the steel companies, they're operating at over 100% capacity utilization. So therefore, they will be investing. But if you look at the other kind of industries where you already have surplus capacity, we are not seeing the same kind of investment taking place. So therefore, the answer is yes and no. Crowding in does take place, but it's not to all the industries. The fundamental problem in our country, I think we can take it on later on, because I think the other speakers should also be given a chance to speak, is that we need to create more jobs. I think that's the only way in which we'll be able to create this consumer demand, which feeds into higher investment from other industries.
Thank you. Radhika, just building on the announcements of the budget, it was very interesting this time that when the finance minister was talking about the numbers of beneficiaries of various public sector programs, she referred to a difference in approach of how public schemes are implemented by the government, where she mentioned that we now go beyond the village level to target every eligible individual in the form of saturation of schemes. And the numbers as far as Ujjwala, PM Kisan, PM Awas, and other social sector schemes are concerned, it does augur well for the country. What do you think in terms of implementation of social sector schemes has fundamentally changed in the last 10 years?
Certainly, and I think an important emphasis here is that, and I think that's what the finance minister touched upon as well, is that she mentioned, some of the basic requirements for the rural areas of the farm community are being addressed first. We can go up the value chain once those basic needs are met. So we started off with things like, for farm community, irrigation, some amount of crop insurance. For the rural sector at large, sadak, roads, electricity, access to bathrooms, for example, drinking water, all of these. So I think they are certainly targeting to meet the basic needs first. And towards that, you've seen a lot of announcements, I think, in the past 4-5 years. One of the important changes that has certainly happened, and that was the final part of your question, it's the delivery of these schemes, right? Earlier, we used to have intended beneficiaries. There used to be funds. And by the time those funds get to the beneficiaries, there used to be at least 40% that's lost in commute. I think the biggest change has happened is in the mechanism of delivering it. And I think that is where digitalization has come in. And I think that is what the direct benefit transfers have done. making sure that the last mile fulfillment happens, there is minimum leakage. I'm sure you can't, in a big country, it's hard to plug it 100%, but insofar as 80-90% goes through to the intended beneficiary, I think we are in good stead already. And when you have, I mean, you can only imagine the kind of multiplier effects if a road is able to reach. I think there are many examples in Bihar and Jharkhand and all these areas which have been cited on, when you take the roads deeper inside the rural areas, it basically means that production from there, even if you take farm production, can reach the cities, can reach the districts much faster, and that can generally lift the living standards of those communities as well. So coming back to the last bit of my last mile delivery, and I think that is just to take a couple of more minutes on this. I think that's where the digital piece, and I think one of the interesting things for me personally was when the finance minister mentioned about digital public infrastructure becoming a factor of production.
Right.
Typically in economics, we just talk about labor, capital, and whatever is excess, but bringing in digitalization, which means that it can add to the growth momentum.
Thanks. Very interesting take on this entire topic. We also welcome Sundaraman sir, who has now joined us. So capital markets and Sensex are a very interesting topic for B school students. And especially in the context of India now becoming the fourth largest share market in the world, overtaking Hong Kong, and our assets under management in the mutual funds now crossing 50 trillion. How do you think the market will respond to the budget in the long run? As a follow-up to that question, sir, do you think the Indian markets with the kind of bull run that we have seen are overheated, or there is sufficient stability mechanisms in place in form of educational initiatives and other factors? Thank you.
Budget reactions are not long-term. Budget impact is long-term. Budget reaction happens on the day when the budget is announced, when the budget is getting announced. But the impact is long-standing and it takes it forward. So the question which you are asking me is how much I look at this budget as a development-oriented budget, which will help in the development of market and deepening and strengthening of market. And do you think that last year's whatever good results and good developments, or rather the exuberance type of a situation which some people feel, is it rational, irrational, is the second question you're asking, if I'm understanding it right.
Right.
What I look at it this way, it's an interim budget. Given it being an interim budget, of course, the trend will continue in the final budget as well. The interim budget has done a great job. It has provided for all sections of the society. It has tried to give a direction, which is a continuing direction of development-oriented policy framework in India. And it also gives a lot of rooms for us to think about the progress that we have made in the past and the continuing progress possibility ahead of us. Therefore, I feel the trend which is there today will continue. That is point number one. Point number two is, if you look at the market, some of us sometimes hear that whether the market is overheated, whether the market is all towards derivatives. The honest answer that what we will give you is, the answer is no, it is not overheated. There is a good amount of economic reason because of which the market is going, the direction it is going. It is not unidirectional. Whenever there are news which are not palatable, the market reacts and it comes down. When some bank says that it is not doing well, naturally the market goes down and accordingly things happen. We are also very careful about two things in our approach as market frontline regulators. If you look at the mandate for SEBI, it is investor protection and development of market. And SEBI has been doing it wonderfully well. All the steps that we have taken today are towards protection of the investor interest. And if there is an overheating in any script or anything, there are surveillance mechanisms which kick in to ensure that whatever is the reason for that overheating is understood. If there is a reason behind it, meaningfully explainable, then it is let go, otherwise actions taken. At this point of time, as to quote even SEBI chair in one of our board meetings, which she mentioned, safety of the market is absolutely fine. The security of the market is absolutely fine. Investor education, investor awareness creation is happening across all parts of the country, and it will continue to happen Whether it is sufficient, never it can be sufficient. It is an ongoing effort.
Thank you, sir, for that take. Just as a follow-up of that question, sir, what do you think the budget? I know it is an interim budget, and we'll have something in July for more for us to discuss in detail. But I ask this more from the capital markets angle. What do you think? The finance minister in the budget speech mentioned that in order to in order for us to migrate to the Viksit Bharat Kal, the MSMEs will have to perform very well. So what are the enabling conditions for MSMEs as far as capital markets is concerned? And I'd like to you to answer this question more on a broader level, sir.
So for MSMEs to perform better, there are, in my opinion, two important points. Whatever is their receivable, they should get it in time. Because they're MSMEs, if the money inflow that has to happen for their working capital is not coming in time, there is a problem. That is taken care of in a big way by various statutes from RBI and from government and others, that whenever there is a payment to be made to MSMEs, that has to be taken care of immediately. That is for the working capital part of it. Second is for the capital raising and their capex part of it. There are multiple ways in which these are getting met today. One of the methods is about them getting listed. There are a lot of processes today involved in for an MSME to get listed. We had framed the regulations for SMEs coming into the stock exchange area through which they will be able to raise capital on an ongoing basis, was decided quite some time before. Probably we need to sit together as regulators, as policy makers, to see what are the areas which pinches the shoes in SMEs coming into the mainboard platform for getting listed, and we need to have policy framework to enable it. There were some efforts taken in the past whereby there will be a single nodal agency which will be able to take care of the capital requirements and subsequently offload into the market through a listing mechanism. Whether that is workable, how to take it forward is another policy framework area where there needs to be a look. If we look at the entire MSME, we say it is a very large set of companies we are talking about. All of them will not be able to come into that mainframe. If we are talking about the companies that can come into this frame of work, we are talking about 60,000 companies, of which around only 1,000 companies are listed today in stock exchanges. So there is a clear need for a relook into all the regulations which we have brought in place at some point of time. And also whatever practices and procedures are there, to see how they can be revitalized to bring more people into the forum.
Thank you, sir. So one of the my question is to Madan, sir. One of the announcement in this year's budget is the 1 lakh crore 50-year interest-free loan in the field of innovation and research. And one of the criticisms of Indian budgets have been that they have not been spending enough on education and research. How do you look at this announcement, sir, in the long term? And will it give the necessary fillip to the Indian economy? Because the finance minister also mentioned that it was in association with the private sector that we will utilize this fund.
Yeah, because I think we should realize that most of whatever growth takes place in the economy is happening in the private sector. So I think when you're talking of this allocation of the funds for R&D, I think it's something which is directed towards the private sector. And we have seen that typically, if you leave out a couple of really high-tech sectors, most of them are the ones who spend less on R&D, because you generally work on the basis that R&D is something which is very futuristic. You invest money today, you're not quite sure what the results will be immediately. It may or may not work. So therefore, there is a bit of hesitancy when it comes to spending on R&D. So if we look at things like pharma, of course, your entire business runs on the basis of innovation. So therefore, one has to be ahead of the curve. But otherwise, we've generally seen that it's in very, very limited quantities. So I think that's one of the reasons why this particular initiative has been taken by the government. That because for rapid growth, which is required in an environment where I think technology is overtaking human beings. We're looking at a case where technology has been used in every particular form. I think R&D becomes very much important in almost every segment. It's not just manufacturing. Even if you actually look at agriculture, now I'm not quite sure what exactly are the details of this particular plan as to how much should we actually be spending also in terms of agriculture. We do have these institutions, agri institutions, which are there, which are working on R&D. But definitely this becomes an integral part for enhancing productivity and bringing about accelerated growth. Now, of course, one has to see as to how this amount spread, how exactly is it going to be utilized, and what actually is going to be the response, because I think this is just an amount which has been mentioned, but the details need to be seen as to which sectors would be the ones which would be targeted, and accordingly one could evaluate what the response would be.
Thank you. Radhika ji, one statement that the finance minister made in the budget was that we are looking for inclusive growth, both social and geographical. And this, for students of IIM Shillong, and Shillong is the only IIM in the Northeast, how do you see the government has been able to bring about that regional balance in development over the years? And does this budget in any way contribute to it? Or we need more to be done for the north and east parts of India?
Sure. So I think the government has emphasized on different kind of a caste balance. I think there was partly a jab on the others who are trying to divide it along religious and racial lines, is to make it more in terms of income levels, right? In terms of bringing the lower income higher and that kind of a caste lines. And I think geographically, as well as you mentioned, I think the budget also contained some policies which were quite geared towards the Northeast as well. Overall, I think among the state levels, what they have done, and I think that they have repeated, and it's not something that's been now here and now, it's at least in the past 5-6 years, they have been emphasizing on a cooperative and competitive federalism, right? So they don't want the states be just given funds. They want them to also participate, show that some of the funds have been used towards social development, and then thereafter additional funds would be given. And you can see that in even when the companies, say for example, even if we talk about global companies looking to invest into India, they do. Of course, the central government is the first point of contact, but eventually when they do invest, the states and their supportive policies become very important. So that's why you have seen certain states being able to attract more investments than the others. And I think it is a function of what the state governments are doing. How are they easing, in terms of investments? How do I put this? How fast they can set up their manufacturing base, for example. How fast can they get the clearances? How fast can they get the land environmental admissions or submissions done, and how fast they can set up their enterprises. So I think that is a very important change that has happened, in the sense you don't give handouts, but make the states a part of the decision making, and as well as bring in a kind of competitiveness between the states, so that which anyway, just like any enterprise works, it's betterment for the economy at large. But insofar as Northeast is concerned, certainly I think more and more in the past 5-6 years you have seen a bend towards increasing not only social spending but also infrastructure in terms of roads, and improving the connect with the mainland, so to speak.
Just to add to what Radhika has said, I think we should remember that there is this whole element of competition which has been engendered by the government across all states. So you do this regular ranking of states in terms of their ease of doing business. And I think states are competing. If you see the entire, I don't remember offhand as to what the ranking is, but you see a number of states which were earlier what you call down the order, they become more proactive and everybody is trying to gain, because at the end of it, we know that everybody knows India is going to be the fastest growing country in future. A lot of potential is there. Everybody wants to invest. The question is, where do I invest? So there are certain states which were earlier considered to be lower down the pecking order, but today they have, you provide all the facilities, make sure things are easy and funds to mine. So I think this has been a very good policy which the center has followed, because we should remember everything goes in terms of cooperative federalism. It has to be the center working along with the states. It can't just be the center doing everything.
Right. For instance, in this budget also, they've continued with the 50-year interest-free loans for capex, subject to certain reforms in power sector and other areas. The students at IIM Shillong are also students of political economy. And when in an interim budget, the finance minister is able to give a fiscal deficit number of 5.1% of GDP and not bring any changes in the direct and indirect taxes. How do you see that in terms of, do you see that as the confidence of the government moving into the elections, or the government adhering to the tradition of the interim budget? And I like all of your reactions on the same.
Okay, I'm not sure who's starting, but let me start then.
Monica, you
Okay.
start, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. See, interim budget, of course, I think markets are markets, right? So when you're going into it, as well as observers at large, expect the interim budget to almost be like a full budget. We expect a lot of announcements in terms of social welfare, and I think I was among them also who was expecting a bit more push towards rural farm community, particularly because they're going through a tough phase in terms of how the climate has been and what's been the impact on output. But it really stayed true to its words. The speech was short. There wasn't any significant announcement in terms of a fresh initiative which requires funds to be set aside. And as well as the overall, I think it was also an opportunity for the government to take stock of what they have done in the past decade in office, right? So that's what an interim budget before an election should sound like, and that's what it sounded like. So coming to your question on have they given 5.1% without making any changes in taxes? To be very honest, right? If we call this counter-cyclical fiscal policy, basically it means that in good times, the kind of consolidation that should happen should be more on the spending basis, right? We can't bank on revenues and keep spending. So I think from that perspective, they haven't provided any boost, but I think there's not been any cutback as well. I think they're still banking on the revenues the way it did last year. Probably a bit conservative on that front, but still expecting revenues to do well. But I think the biggest chunk of change has come from the revenue expenditure. We spoke about it earlier in the session, Vivek. So where, these are recurring expenses that happen every year. There has been a big change, at least when you see as a calculation, because everything is percentage of GDP when you come to the fiscal deficit. And there you have seen subsidies, for example, food as well as fertilizer subsidies have been, allocated a bit smaller size. So that's where chunk of the deficit correction is coming from, and a bit of a change in the taxes, a bit higher in non-taxes, a bit lower in taxes and all of that. So those are really small numbers. So revenue expenditures where the chunk of the consolidation has come from. And of course, growth overall is expected to do better. It did about 8.6 to 8.9% of GDP the year we are in. Fiscal 25 is at about 10.5. So again, your denominator is bigger, the deficit is not very different, so it's going to look good. So that is what the underlying math is. But truth be told, I think this is again, we are looking into at least 12 to 18 months ahead. Many things can change. But the July budget in that perspective, I think will become much more important. And there you could see very clear social-driven agenda, welfare-driven agenda, as well as some support for the middle class.
So I can go next.
Sundaram, please.
Sorry, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, I said I was going to welcome you only to speak, Sundaram. Nice meeting you after a long time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Same here. And see, as Radhika is, of course, an eloquent speaker and she can put across her words and views nicely. I'm not that good. Let me try my best, though. Well, the direction of the interim budget and the final budget may be same. But being a pre-election interim budget, the amounts that can be announced towards social welfare and other schemes, and therefore the revenue part of the budget, could have had its own constraints so that it's not misinterpreted as something else. That could be one reason. And second is in the area of the capex part of it, I feel that given the way the let us look at it this way. Initially, what government was doing, it was disinvesting from its PSU shares, and whatever the money comes in a way was getting channeled also into the capex. To a great extent, a lot of stuff which government wanted to disinvest is happening and has happened, may happen more, but the trend may come down because there are a lot of good PSUs today. The PSU index, if you look at it, is also going up in a big way. there has been a lot of efficiency and overall development everywhere. And at this point of time, the country is also maturing enough to take care of the capital expenditure from the private sector. And private sector is also booming. There is a good amount of capital creation happening from a lot of entrepreneurs who are coming in to fill in the gap in this area. So given that, I feel the development will certainly continue. The growth rate, which is projected, clearly indicates that orientation. The final budget will in fact take us further deeper into it, is my view.
Madan, so you are muted. I think you need to unmute yourself.
I thought I'd
Yeah.
unmuted myself. Yeah. See, on this particular subject, let me go back to where I began, saying that budget is nothing else about managing the Excel sheet. Okay. So what has the government done? We know that 5.1%, we're going towards 4.5. So therefore, the 5.1% deficit number has been fixed. They've been very, very reasonable to make sure that you don't go wrong in terms of your revenue projections. So I think assuming that a 10.5% GDP growth has been a very, very prudent thing to do. So therefore, when my revenue side has been fixed, both in terms of what would come on account of inherent buoyancy or you see in the economy, along with what was the maximum amount which I would like to borrow from all various sources, I have my total income which is there in place. Now, within this, I think there's definitely been a kind of a tilt which has been there saying that I think 40% of the incremental size of the budget. So the budget has gone up by around 2.76 lakh crores. I remember we were dealing with so many numbers 48 hours back. I keep getting confused with these numbers. But
You're right,
40% of the incremental size of the budget is going for capex. So that is
Yes.
going to be the growth-driven part of the budget. And I think the rest of the funds have generally been allocated across the existing schemes so that electoral prudence is being followed. We have fiscal prudence also in place. And I think when we finally have the main budget, I think all they have to do is you'll get 3 months of knowledge about what has been happening during the course of the year. You'll get to know what's happening in terms of the monsoon. And then accordingly, there can be any kind of reallocations which you have to make. Reallocations will, of course, mean more in the upward direction or in the downward direction. Not normally in the downward direction, more likely in the upward direction. So I think that's how this cogent budgeting has been done. So I think 2 points, fiscal prudence, number one, and 2, growth push to the extent that it's possible. That's what they have done. And you can interpret it any way you want to in terms of the social welfare schemes. I always believe that they're absolutely essential in a country like India. Today, when we say multi-dimensional poverty concept, we brought it down from 27, 28% to 11%. It's primarily on account of direct intervention by the government. And this is something which has to continue. Because when we say that consumption is lagging because we don't have people spending money, we need to make sure that people are in a position to spend. If I have to wait for the private sector to create all the jobs and create this, it could take another 10, 20 years. So therefore, I think the government is providing a lot of relief directly. And then you're waiting for the other things to pick up. Like the government you spend on roads, construction goes up, large number of unskilled labor also enters the workforce. There is some bit of income which is being generated. So that process is carrying on, but the pace is definitely much slower than in case there is direct intervention. So I think that's how the government is managing it very well.
Right. It has been a very learning and riveting discussion till now. So I'll open it up for the students to also ask a few questions to our esteemed panelists. Niveshak, please take over.
Yeah. So students can raise their hands and then one by one you can ask questions. So Himanshu Sharma, you can go ahead. You are on mute, Himanshu.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, sir and ma'am, for the enriching insights from this interim budget. So as we discussed about the capex investment, that the government is consistent for capex investment in the budget. But this type of investment requires the funding apart from the tax revenue that the government gets. And because of this, the government issues bonds as well. But there is consistent pressure on the government to provide higher bond yields because of the poor credit ratings given by the companies like S&P, Fitch, and S&P and Fitch companies, because they have been biased towards the Western countries. And moreover, the metrics that are used by these companies for evaluating the credit ratings are more of qualitative in comparison to quantitative metrics. So even the countries like Philippines are having higher credit ratings in comparison to India, which is actually 1/10 the GDP of our country. So what should the government do to get hold over these companies to provide the right justice to the credit ratings that our country gets?
Radhika, you should go first on this, and then Sundaram, then I'll come in third.
Okay. Thanks, Ivanshu. Thank you for your question. And I think that is certainly something that's front and center of the government's attention, I think in the budget as well, that was mentioned. The kind of framework, at least from what we understand with the agencies, the kind of framework they use, they have multiple silos, right? So I think on many of the silos, we obviously rank very well. Especially when we talk about external balances, current account reserve. So that is done. Institutional strength, I think, is amongst the best. Then you've got overall GDP and recovery prospects. That's doing very well as well. So there are two things that the rating agencies have been, highlighting time and again. One of them, I'm with you, I agree, which is basically per capita GDP. I mean, that is one of the slowest moving metrics. You're not going to get up just merely because of the size of our population. It's an arithmetic that is very hard to beat. So even 10, 20 years from now, we'll be moving on that metrics very slowly. I think that is one thing that they've raised, which I personally also don't really agree with, but I guess that's one of their boxes they need to tick. And the other one is basically fiscal. Fiscal balance is something that has been brought about, fiscal health has been brought about time and again. And I think that's where I think we got to so we focus a lot on the deficit and the incremental deficit change. But where this comes and sticks with us is basically 80% of GDP, which is our cumulative fiscal, debt or government debt. Like I said at the very start, interim budget is all about the center's finances. When we put in center and state together, our deficits look bigger, our debt looks even bigger than that. And when you compare the EM average, you spoke about Philippines, the other country that is actually rated higher than us is Indonesia. Now, Indonesia's own deficit or debt levels are about 37, 38% of GDP. Again, not comparable in terms of our population and per capita GDP, but when you just look at deficit and debt levels, they're at a healthier position. So I think that is something that's sticky, but needs to be brought down. But as deficits come down, those debt levels will also come down. So I think 70, 75% kind of levels perhaps is where we might see a rating change. But certainly I think they are taking notice, and I think each time we have positive outcomes and recovery becomes a lot more, there's more clarity on the recovery prospects and outlook. I think our chances go up as well. Sir, all yours.
Great. So my take is similar to that of what Radhika said. It is actually the countries what we are talking about as Philippines and Indonesia are honestly not comparable because of the sheer size of where we are in. And the direction in which the country is moving towards is certainly going to take us ahead of the numbers where we are. And I'm very positive about it.
On this view of credit rating, I've worked in a credit rating agency earlier before I came to Bank of Baroda. I've been here since 2022. I've worked for almost 12 years in a credit rating company. So we've been having interactions naturally with international credit rating agencies too. And the sense which I got was that, as what Radhika mentioned, fiscal is something which is always a sore point. They say your debt levels are very high. So when you point out and say that, look at America, look at Japan, their ratios are over 100%. They say those countries are the anchor currencies in the world. And I say anchor in the sense that they are the reserve currencies. So unless they have higher levels of debt, only then will dollars or yen or pound or euros be made available to the rest of the world. India is not an anchor currency. So how much ever we are talking of internationalization of the rupee, which I think the RBI and the government has taken certain steps, but we need that acceptance of it. Only then will high levels of debt be acceptable. The second point on the debt is that people forget, the rating agencies forget that our debt is totally in rupees. We don't have any dollar debt. which means that there is no potential threat to the world, even with an 80%, even if my debt goes to 100%, as long as it's in local currency, it's not really a threat to the world economy. So therefore, I think that is something which is fallacious, but we have to live with that. And as what Radhika was saying, 80% cannot become 20% tomorrow, because we are adding a fiscal deficit. Even when I get to 3% of ratio, I'm going to be keeping adding debt every year, because every time I borrow, every time there's a fiscal deficit, there will be something which is going to be added to my stock of debt. So that's going to keep increasing. The second sore point which they've always had is privatization. And they have actually caught us on the wrong foot every time, saying that, look, you people said you will do 50,000 crores, you end up doing 20,000 crores. You say 1 lakh crores, you do 30,000 crores. Now, they say that the government doesn't have any interest in actually privatizing. It's a kind of a balancing item which is there in the budget. This was their normal grievance. So I think it is, I always feel that things like disinvestment should be kept outside the budget, so that you're drawing up a budget without looking at this particular thing, which is driven also by ideology in a country like India. Like today, for example, sometime back you said one of the oil marketing companies should be fully privatized. But if you do such a thing, then we won't be protected on the price front. But nonetheless, this is the second grievance which they have. The third one which they always have is saying that your labor laws are very stringent. I've never understood this, because I think all of us in the private sector, I'm of course now in the public sector, my last phase, but otherwise in the private sector, you can be fired anytime. Look at the IT companies, people are being sacked left, right, and center. Look at the foreign banks, private sector banks, people are losing jobs. So I don't know where they talk of stickiness of labor. Maybe they're looking at it at the lower end, the blue-collar workers, but most of them are anyway contractual workers. So I think these are the three sore points. And the counter argument we always had is that if you think India is not such a great country, we are triple B minus. Investment and FPI on a number of occasions. That means people who want to invest, foreigners love to invest in India, but the rating agencies are having these kind of mindsets. They are not willing to make any compromise, saying that India is not like United States. When we have a high level of people who are what you call underprivileged, there needs to be direct action. You cannot say all subsidies are bad. Actually, if you look at Western countries, they also provide a lot of subsidies for their farmers. Food is heavily subsidized even out there. And I think with America, talking of America first, there's no reason why America is not doing things which we are not doing. But I think these are basically mindsets, and it's going to be very, very difficult. I think the government has been saying, and me in my personal capacity, I have been writing in the media saying that these people have gotten it wrong. But I think the hard fact which we have to accept is that it's not going to change. And the unfortunate part is that the government of India actually doesn't need to be patted on the back by rating agencies. But when companies in India are borrowing overseas, the rating comes in the way, because you cannot be better than than the country. So if India is triple B minus, a company, even if I'm triple A in India, I cannot go beyond triple B minus. If I have international operations, I can go 2 notches higher, which means I go to triple B plus. I can never become an A. So I think this is just a cruel reality. I hope the mindsets change, and methodologies should be a bit more flexible. But I don't really see it changing too much. We'll remain at this periphery, triple B minus, triple B, unless the rating agencies are willing to sit down and actually reevaluate everything. Look at America; it's on the verge of a default almost every year. I think now they've been brought to double A plus. I think one of the rating agencies brought it down from triple A. We've never been in that kind of position, yeah. And everybody is investing in India. But anyway, this is more getting emotional, but I think we just have to accept that this is a hard fact which we have to live with.
Thank you, sir. Next question, please.
Abhishek, you can
Thank
go
you
ahead.
very much, sir. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this informative session. My question is to Radhika ma'am. So, ma'am, as per the recent CRISIL report, the corporate tax has a tax buoyancy of 3. And if I'm correct, the higher the tax buoyancy, higher is the revenue generated without increasing the tax rate. So, what measures could the government implement from here on to utilize buoyancy more and increase the percentage of corporate tax in the overall tax collection?
Thanks, Abhishek. And I think the other panelists might also be able to provide a much more informative answer. So my initial take on this would be that, see, corporate tax, of course, the buoyancy, we are coming off the couple of things that have improved the corporate buoyancy. post-pandemic or even during the pandemic, formalization of the economy had taken off, right? So the much more are able to pay taxes. The corporates were generally doing very well. They had healthier margins, and that's why you have seen them actually go on ahead and the corporate tax in general, direct taxes overall, buoyancy has gone up. What can be done? I think certainly corporates need to continue to do well, of course, to pay. I think in the tax structure overall, there's been higher due diligence. There has also been, digitalization of records that has helped as well. So that has structurally changed and improved not only direct taxes but indirect taxes as well. So generally, the better the economy does, the better the corporates do, and say input costs are also kept in. So input costs are sometimes in their control, sometimes it's not. Especially if you see another again. Unfortunately, the past 2 years we have seen fresh outbreaks of wars or geopolitical tensions come up. We have seen, fertilizer prices go up. We've seen oil prices go up, which is beyond, or commodities in general, which is beyond their something that they can control. Now that has come back to impact their margins as well. But if those stay low, that will also improve their overall bottom line. In performance-wise, and help people to contribute much more. I think one thing that, and remember that in terms of taxes, one thing that was expected to be announced but probably got missed and will be dealt with in the June-July budget was this 15%, this special incentive that was given to new manufacturing firms. That tax rate was something that is going to expire soon and was expected to be extended. We do think that will still happen. So I don't think corporate tax collections can go up by higher tax rates. Of course, there is cess and all of that which is added on. But I think it has to be more the efficiency and the corporate performance which will bring about more corporate taxes. I think the overall direction of the government is to provide more relief to corporates. So I would think that gradually corporate tax rates will come down, the domestic ones at least. And I think that's a broader direction that globally things are going through as well. And of course, they've placed a floor on how low corporate taxes can go. But ours is on the higher bracket, and I think will gradually go down as well. Madan, I'm not sure if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think I'll say something, and I think Sundaraman can come later because he's going to defend the markets afterwards. See, the thing is, what I see is that corporate tax collections are going to depend upon how well the companies do. If I take you back to 22-23 was a year where profitability was not really that good. 23-24, we have seen, probably because of the base effect, as well as the fact that companies have started doing better this year, we've seen profits actually being very good in the first 3 quarters. And I suppose even in the fourth quarter, we will have good results. And that's one of the reasons why tax collections have gone up. Now, can the government do anything? I would tend to believe that in 2019, when they lowered the rate, the whole idea was that this should help to spur investment, spur overall output. But that hasn't really happened. So if I have to be very, very harsh, I'll say that the corporate sector has not really quite delivered on what the government had expected when they lowered the rates. And that was the whole idea. If you look at supply side economics, you say you lower the rates because that gives you an incentive to invest. You produce more, you pay more tax, and therefore the government also benefits from it. So that was the Laffer curve theory. It was supposed to work here, but of course we had COVID. We always have this excuse of COVID came for 2 years, and then we had the wars which came in, global commodity prices first spike, now they've come down. So one of the reasons why we are seeing corporate profits doing very well this year is that commodity prices have also eased. We didn't have that in 22-23. That's why the profits were depressed. So a lot of what happens to your corporate tax collections are going to be driven to a very large extent by how the companies do, which means how the economy overall performs. So just remember that today, when we're talking of 10.5% growth, 8.9% growth, the Indian potential actually to grow should be in the region, in GDP should grow at over 8%. Add to that 4-5% of GDP deflator, I should be talking of an economy growing at minimum 12%, if not 12.5% to 13%. But because of all these setbacks, which a whole global economy has gone through, it's not just India. I think we are doing better because we are closer towards the 7% range, trying to control inflation. So I think we need to get to that range of 8% when we actually see buoyant corporate tax collections without changing any of the rates. This theory of saying I lower rates and increase taxes, I don't think it will it really work unless you're able to grow at that rapid pace. And stock markets, to my mind, I think here Sundaramani may not like it. I think they have not been really aligned. This year it's fine, but even last year we saw the stock market doing well at a time when the corporates were not faring that well.
Honestly, I have nothing specific to add. As a listed entity, I will have my own restrictions in talking about certain areas. Nothing specific I have here to add.
That is perfectly fine, sir. One more question, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Vivek. Good evening, panel. Thank you for this enlightening session. My question is to Mr. Madan. So the fiscal deficit financing is expected to be highly reliant on market borrowings for this year, with around 72% deficit expected to be financed through this method. So, in your opinion, is this increase in reliance on the market borrowings because of the yields that are expected to decrease in this fiscal year? And to add on to this, how would you expect crude and the geopolitical risks existing currently to have an impact on this?
If you look at the ratio of gross of your rather your net borrowings to fiscal deficit has remained more or less stable. If you look at the other major source of borrowing, it's normally your from the small savings fund, NSSF. So I think that kind of proportion has actually been maintained. Ideally, the government would prefer to borrow from the market because the cost is lower. Because when you pay from the borrow from the NSSF, then you pay a higher cost because whatever is the average cost, like if I'm getting on my small savings, say 8% on my provident fund, you borrow at 50 basis points higher than that. Whereas if you're borrowing in the market, you get it at a lower cost. So I don't think the government is deliberately borrowing more or less. They would actually ideally like to borrow more from the market. But today the concern is always there that we don't want a situation in which too much of government borrowing is something which crowds out the private sector in the sense that it keeps interest rates up. So that's the only reason why a balance is being struck by the government between borrowing in the market and using the other sources of funding. But here I think Radhika is a person more in the market. She should be able to give you a more intelligent reply.
No, I don't think I can add much to that, except to say that rightly, as Madan observed, I don't think the ratios are, again, you can do gross borrowings as a percentage of overall requirement or net borrowings as a percentage of overall requirement. It hasn't gone far. If anything, we have gone back to the pre-pandemic time, and it's fairly stable. Of course, the quantum of the borrowings also matter, and I think that quantum has come down between last year and this year, or rather this year and fiscal 24 and fiscal 25, they're going to borrow less. I think there are some technical things underneath, which is assessed and all of that. But leaving that aside, I think in terms of the issuance size is going to go down marginally. We should, while all of this is from the issue side, we should also see the demand. Who else? So always in the bond markets, when the government is printing, not the government is printing, but the government is borrowing, who is buying, or are there enough buyers on the other side becomes important. And I think this year fiscal 25 is going to be interesting from that perspective, because foreigners have generally played a very small role in the demand mix. This time, because of India's bonds, or selective India's bonds going to be on the global indices, you're going to see incrementally higher foreign interest. And in some ways, bringing this fiscal deficit down so sharply, if we're able to deliver on it, actually signals very good fiscal discipline, and in turn makes outside investors most enthusiastic as well. But again, even if they increase, they will, as a percentage of overall participation, it will still be more domestic players, institutional, provident fund, insurance companies, banks, but foreigners will play incrementally a bigger role in the demand mix. I think that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Next question.
Tanish, you can go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you again for such an insightful session. So my question is for Sundararaman sir. So as of December 22, foreign ownership in Indian bonds has been one of the lowest in comparison to emerging peers like Brazil, Malaysia, and Mexico. So could you please provide an opinion on the potential reasons for this? And what role would the inclusion into the JPMC Emerging Markets Bond Index play? And do you think any other tax reform can be implemented to increase the inflow of cash into the Indian economy post this inclusion? Thank you.
Sure. See, here there is a good amount of history associated with it. If we are talking about FPIs getting investment into the Indian debt securities, particularly if you're talking of government bonds and all, there have been a lot of restrictions to them in the initial stages. That is one point which we should not forget. And we also know that even today there are amount restrictions that are put on how much of debt investments that they can hold. And second is the liquidity part of the debt instruments in India. They've not been very actively liquid. If you look at it, there are multiple reasons for it. The market is not deep, the market is not liquid, the market is amongst a few people in the market, like banks and very few entities like PDs. So unless and until that deepens, no, then you will not be able to expect more and more flow. And of course, there is a limit of whatever is the ceiling that has been put in place. Foreign inflow fueling development was one of the most important ingredients some time before. In 1990s and 2000s and 2010 also, if you look at it, a good amount of FDI and FPI inflow was what was determining and driving the economic development. While I will not undermine it even today, but my opinion is slightly different in this area. The economic development of an economy is run by three areas mainly. One is investment. Today, there is a good amount of domestic investment that is coming in. Of course, foreign investments also. Second is exports. There is a good amount of export, and there are a lot of scope for us in improving exports, and which we are doing. Third is consumption, which Sabnam is also talked about how the consumption engine is very important, how it is getting fuel. There, both the private and public expenditure will keep it running. So there are a lot of factors. It is just not the foreign investment which is going to determine the development of the country and the pace of development. So, and the inclusion of India into this thing which you talked about certainly has seen more interest in investment by FPIs into debt instruments, and I think that will continue.
So, in fact, the finance minister mentioned FDI as first develop India, completely echoing with your views here.
Yeah.
Maybe time for one or two questions, then let us quickly.
So due to time constraints, we'll be having the last question, and Bansi, you can go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. So thank you so much for this insightful session. My question is that in our budget, recent budgets, MSME sector has been allocated around 22,000 for the coming fiscal, right? Which is above which is almost 41% above last fiscal year's budget. And above of this, 56% is allocated directed towards the credit. However, if we see the credit penetration has been below 20% for this particular sector. So what measures do you think could be implemented in order to improve this credit penetration further? Thank you.
Madan, would you want to go ahead?
Actually, you can take it. I really don't have an answer here. What more can be done? Because I think we have certain existing schemes which are there for the MSMEs, both in terms of bank finance, that's the Mudra schemes which are there, as well as the refinance which comes through the SIDBI route. So I'm not aware of if there's anything more which could be done from the side, yeah? from the banking side. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing to add from my end.
Same here. I don't think I have anything to add here.
In fact, the MSME sector was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Emergency Credit Client Guarantee Scheme during COVID, which helped a lot of them not close down.
Yeah, but that was of the past. Now saying that
Yeah.
can this be extended for another 2 years, 3 years? So that's a call which the government has probably not taken so far. One can always say that you keep extending it. Because we see whatever help has been given to the MSMEs has always been done through the banking system. And has been done more in the form of guarantees which are given because it becomes a contingent liability for the government. There's no direct commitment which comes for the same. And the performance of ECLGS, to the best of my knowledge, has been fairly good. We haven't seen a very high delinquency rate. So I think that's a positive which is there. Something which probably has to be persevered with, but it's a call which the government takes.
So I think we have come to the end of a very great discussion over the last more than 1 hour now, where we touched various aspects of the budget. Niveshak, anything more, or should we thank our guests for the evening and close the session?
Yes, sir. We can conclude the session.
Thank you so much to all the esteemed panelists for your time and for your very intriguing and insightful comments on the interim budget 2024. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks a
you so
lot for
much for
having
having
me here.
us.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for sort of reuniting me with Sundaraman and Radhika. I think even though it's virtually, but it's good. We're doing it through Shillong, nothing like it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and
All
apologies
the
for
best.
me joining late due to technical issue.
No problem, sir. No problem. Thank you.
And
Thank
all
you
the
for your
best to
time.
the students. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. All the participants can drop off from the call. My God. Hello.